Some moments don't end loudly. They fade, quietly. This is one of those moments. It began in a way that didn't feel like a beginning at all. There was no clear shift, no moment you could point to and say, this is where it changed. Just a quiet space, barely noticeable at first, like the air in a room growing slightly cooler without anyone opening a window. I used to notice things as they happened, small things. A message arriving at the exact moment I thought of sending one, a shared reaction to something ordinary, a line in a show, a passing comment, a photo that didn't mean much to anyone else. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. It was just there, like background noise that somehow made everything feel more complete. At some point, without realizing it, I started expecting those moments. Not in a demanding way, not consciously, but there was a rhythm that had settled in, something quiet and consistent, a kind of presence that didn't need to announce itself. It just showed up. And I think that's what made the absence harder to notice, because when something becomes part of the background, you stop checking for it. You assume it will be there. In the beginning, there was no reason to question it. Messages came in small bursts, sometimes early in the day, sometimes late at night. There wasn't a pattern you could map out, but there was enough consistency to make it feel reliable, not predictable, but familiar. Familiar in the way a room feels when you've spent enough time in it. You don't look around anymore, you just exist inside it. I didn't think about how often it happened. I didn't count. I didn't measure. It wasn't something I kept track of. It was just there. And then, slowly, it wasn't. Not all at once. At first, it was a slight delay, a message that arrived later than expected. Not concerning, just different enough to notice if you were paying attention. But I wasn't. Because nothing felt wrong. There was still conversation, still responses, still small exchanges that carried the same tone, the same familiarity. If anything, it felt almost identical, just slightly off, like a song playing at the same volume, but missing one of the background layers you didn't realize was there until it disappeared. I remember one evening in particular. There wasn't anything special about it, just the usual end-of-day quiet, the kind where everything slows down and the world feels a little more distant. I had something small to share. Nothing important, just one of those things that didn't really matter, except that it felt like it should be said. So I picked up my phone, typed the message, read it once, and sent it. There was no hesitation, no second thought. It was the kind of action that had become automatic. I didn't wait for a response, not consciously. I set my phone down, moved on with the rest of the evening, made something to eat, let the background noise of the room settle into its usual rhythm. Time passed in the way it always does, quietly, without announcement. At some point, I checked. Just a glance. No message. It didn't feel significant. Not yet, because sometimes responses take time. Sometimes people get busy. There are always reasons. So I didn't think about it again. The next day felt the same. Normal in the way that normal is often just the absence of anything unusual. There were other messages, other conversations, notifications that filled the space without asking for attention. But not that one. It stayed unanswered. I noticed it then, not in a sharp way, not with concern, just a small awareness, like recognizing something out of place in a room you've seen 100 times before. It didn't feel like a problem, just different. And still, I didn't follow up. There was no urgency, because the pattern hadn't broken completely. It had just shifted. Days passed. Not many, just enough to blur together slightly, and the pattern continued. Messages were still there, but they were different, shorter, less frequent, less automatic. I found myself pausing before sending something, Not because I didn't want to, but because the moment didn't feel as clear as it used to. Before, it had been easy. Now there was a quiet hesitation, not enough to stop me, just enough to make me notice. And that's when I started paying attention, not in a deliberate way, more like a slow awareness that something had changed, even if I couldn't fully explain it. There were gaps now. Small ones at first. Moments where I would expect something, not because it was promised, but because it had always happened before. And when it didn't, the absence lingered just long enough to be felt. Not enough to hurt, just enough to register. I started remembering things differently. Looking back, trying to understand if it had always been this way, or if I had just missed it. But memory doesn't work that way. It smooths things over, fills in gaps, makes everything feel more consistent than it actually was. So I couldn't be sure. I just knew that something felt quieter, less immediate, less present. The realization didn't come all at once. It arrived in fragments, a missed response here, a delayed reply there, a conversation that didn't quite continue the way it used to. Each piece small enough to ignore on its own, but together they started to form something I couldn't quite name. One night, I didn't send anything. It wasn't intentional, at least not at first. I just didn't. There was something I could have shared, a thought, a moment, something small that would have fit easily into the space where messages used to go, but I paused. Not because I was unsure, just because I wanted to see what would happen if I didn't fill the space, if I let it stay empty. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, not immediately. It felt neutral, like stepping back from something familiar and noticing the shape it leaves behind. I told myself it didn't mean anything, that it was just a pause, just one night. But I paid attention, more than I had before. I noticed the absence of a message, not as something missing, but as something that wasn't replaced. There was no interruption, no unexpected notification filling the space, just nothing. And that's when it started to feel different. Not worse, not better, just clearer. The next day, I did the same thing. Again, not as a decision, just a continuation. I let the space remain empty, and I watched. The pattern didn't change. No message arrived to break the silence. No sudden return to what it had been. It just continued, quiet, consistent in its absence. And that's when I understood something. Not in a dramatic way, not with clarity that felt final, just a quiet recognition. The pattern hadn't broken. It had been changing for a while. I just hadn't noticed. Or maybe I hadn't wanted to. Because when something fades slowly, it doesn't ask for your attention. It lets you adjust without realizing it. Until one day you look around and realize the room feels different, and you can't remember exactly when it changed. I thought about sending a message, just to see, to interrupt the silence, to test if the pattern could return. But I didn't. Not because I was avoiding it, just because I didn't feel the need to anymore. The urgency was gone, the expectation had faded, and without those, the action itself felt different, less automatic, more optional. Days passed again. This time I didn't track them, didn't measure the distance between moments, because there were fewer moments to measure. The space had settled into something new, something quieter, and strangely it didn't feel empty, just different. I realized then that nothing had really ended. There was no final message, no clear moment of closure, just a gradual shift that had already completed itself before I fully saw it. It had been happening quietly in the background, while everything else continued as normal, and now it was just done. Not in a way that needed acknowledgement, just in a way that existed. I didn't feel the need to change it, didn't feel the need to bring it back, because whatever it had been, it had already faded. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just slowly, and I had let it, without noticing, or maybe without stopping it. I'm not sure there's a difference. Sometimes understanding comes too late. If this story felt familiar, you're not alone. Thank you for listening. We'll continue next time.